Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 58th EOcafe. 58, it's incredible. So, as you know, the EOcafe, where we try to help you understand and educate and discuss different topics of interest to the EO community and allow the EO community to meet and to exchange. Just a quick reminder on the rules. Please keep your microphones off unless asked you to join in the conversation. You can certainly leave your cameras on. We quite like to see you, and it helps to improve the the environment of the EOcafe. So it's nice if you leave those on. But and put any questions you have into the chat, and I will ask you to join. If we take the question, I'll ask you to join and put the question yourself. So that's the basic rules. So this is the second EOcafe in a row where we're dealing with a subject which is linked to an ERSC working group. It's not planned that way, it just happens to be the way it's fallen. Last time we looked at defence, and this time we're looking at work of the Green Deal Working Group in ERSC, or work linked to the Green Deal Working Group, and specifically about Earth observation related to methane emissions. And I'm really, really pleased that we're joined by two experts from the United Nations, from UNEP, Cynthia Randalls in the US, who is the Mars project manager at the IMEO. We'll come on to all that, some of these acronyms in a minute. And Megan Demeter, who is the implementation project manager at UNEP's IMEO. And as usual, let me just ask them each just to introduce themselves to kick off so that you understand and know them a little bit better. So I'm not quite sure who will start. Cynthia's first on my list. So Cynthia, if you kick off and introduce yourself.
Sure, thanks. My name is Cynthia Randalls. I'm the project manager for the Methane Alert and Response System at UNEP's International Methane Emissions Observatory, or IMEO. There'll be a lot of acronyms today, so you'll get UNEP, IMEO, Mars. So I'm involved in all of those. I have a background in atmospheric modeling and climate modeling. And I spent many years also working in the energy industry before coming over to UNEP. We just kicked off Mars at the beginning of this year, and we're currently in our pilot phase, and I'll talk about that more later, I'm sure. But I'm happy to talk about it today and introduce it to all of you. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Cynthia. Megan?
Hi, everyone. My name is Megan Demeter. Happy to be here today. I'm the implementation project manager at UNEP's International Methane Emissions Observatory, as you've heard, IMEO. So my background is in energy and environmental policy. So within IMEO, I wear a couple of different hats, but primarily I lead our engagement with countries. So helping to build capacity to access and interpret the data that we provide through IMEO. And in the context of Mars, as I'm sure we'll speak more about later, this also involves the process through which we notify governments of emissions events.
Great. And if I understand correctly, Megan, you're based in Paris and Cynthia, you're in New York, yeah?
Yes, that's correct.
Great. Okay. So it's a really international EOcafe today. So I mentioned at the beginning the Green Deal Working Group within ERSC, which is looking at the policy actions within the Green Deal and working with the Commission to understand those, and looking at the role of Earth observation and particularly the private sector in responding to that. And one of the steps taken by the Commission has been the I see some holes in my notes. The Commission has responded to the IPCC, sorry, to introduce new regulations around greenhouse gas emissions and looking at economic-wide climate neutrality by 2050. And that is very much in response and in cooperation with UNEP, where the sort of overall policy is being discussed and set up, and we'll hear more about it. So amongst the greenhouse gases which are concerned, methane is one of the most severe, as I'm sure everybody here understands. It has a global warming potential more than 80 times greater than that for carbon dioxide, and is today responsible for more than 25% of the warming that we are experiencing. In consequence, the Paris Agreement, which led to the setting up of the IMEO, cannot be reached without stringent measures to reduce methane emissions. And I'm sure that Cynthia or Megan will develop that and expand on that far better than I can. So UNEP has launched the IMEO, the International Methane Observatory, in 2021. And it is a key implementing component of the Global Methane Pledge, which is an EU-US-led effort gathering together 150 countries to reduce global methane emissions with a target of reduction of 30% by 2030. Agriculture is the largest single source of methane, which accounts for 40% of anthropogenic emissions. But it's distributed, and so the focus of the work in both the EU and within UNEP is focusing on fossil fuel emissions, and we'll hear a lot more about that as we go on. And according to the IMEO, fossil fuels have by very far the greatest short-term reduction potential, and therefore are the priority. So this was the sort of background and the setting up of the IMEO. So firstly, maybe we can understand a bit more about IMEO and what its objectives are and how it's working. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about IMEO. Megan, is that one fall to you?
Sure. I'm happy to take that question. So I've had the fortune of being a part of this team since the inception of IMEO. Now, as you said, we launched in 2021. Obviously had started the thinking around it prior to that.
Sure.
And we actually worked very closely with the Commission to design and implement IMEO, and they remain a close partner of ours through Mars and through all of the work that we do at IMEO. So the generation of IMEO was really the recognition that there is a lack of accurate data that can help us target and pinpoint action at the speed and the scale required to achieve the Paris Agreement. And that even when that action or that data does exist, it's not always reaching the hands of those who can actually implement methane mitigation. So the key objective of IMEO is to provide open, reliable, and actionable data to the stakeholders, the individuals who actually can act on emissions. So for that reason, we work really closely with partners across governments, industry, other NGOs, et cetera, to ensure that this data is getting into the hands of those that need it in order to implement action. And we do that through a couple of different work streams. We have one on science, where we fund scientific measurement studies led by leading academic and research institutions around the world. Just as a quick snippet of where some of those are taking place. At the end of last year, we conducted one of the first direct measurement campaigns in Africa, offshore Angola and Gabon. We'll be conducting measurements in Oman and Colombia later this year, as well as across Australia, across Europe, and a variety of other locations. We also have a work stream on transparency, which is called the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership. This is a voluntary measurement-based reporting framework for the oil and gas industry. We have over 100 member companies now, representing over 1/3 of global oil and gas production, who are reporting their methane emissions data to UNEP in the most credible, transparent, and verifiable manner. And then our final work stream is called implementation. This is how we're engaging with countries and with partners. We've developed a virtual methane emissions training series, which is, we developed this virtually to allow us to deploy it to countries around the world at a much quicker rate than if we always needed to be in person. So for that reason, we've been able to train almost 25 countries and over 400 participants in just the last 2 years. And the training was really established to help provide stakeholders with the most important information on methane emission sources, technologies, measurement methodologies to support them to actually be able to take action. And one of our newest initiative is the methane alert and response system, which I'm sure we'll talk about in much more detail.
I was just going to come on to that. So you refer to Mars. This was launched, I think, in November last year. You mentioned it's in partnership with over 100 of the major oil and gas companies around the world. The methane alert and response system will be based on the use of satellite data, but not just satellite data. Tell us more about how Mars will operate, and then I think we'll probably dig down further into the way Mars is foreseen. Cynthia?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so Mars was envisioned as a way to connect this wealth of data that we now have from the satellites to the actual users on the ground to actually spur action. So it involves multiple steps. The first and foremost, of course, is detection of the emissions in the first place, which we are primarily using satellites. But to make that information useful, we not only need to detect the emissions, we also need to attribute it to specific facilities or operators. So that, of course, entails other data sets, such as infrastructure data sets, and a bit of detective work in some instances. And so once that's done, we move on to what we call our notification component, where we are having to engage with both companies and operators to inform them of the information that we've taken with the satellites and work with them to try to better understand what's actually happening on the ground. And the third component is really on the onus of the companies or the emitters. It's to really take action. And what Mars can do at that stage, along with our partners at the IEA, the International Energy Agency, and the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, or CCAC, is to provide them with information or contacts to help them along their mitigation journey. And then the fourth component of Mars is really just to document everything, document the data we're taking from the satellites, but also the communications that we have with the operators and companies, and eventually make all this data publicly available. And that is just a way both to shine a light on the greater issues to do with methane, but also to give companies the opportunity to show best-in-class operations in their willingness to participate in the mitigation process. Okay,
as we come on to mitigation in a minute, I'm just as we were preparing this this call, I was struck by an article that was published in The Guardian, which I assume was in some way stimulated by the launch of Mars and or a report or a press release. It seemed too much of a coincidence. But as well as the Mars activity, it included data from an Earth member, Kairos, which was very interesting to see. And the article was highlighting these super emitting sites, which is 1,000 super emitting sites have been identified over the previous 12 months, I think it was, and something like 50 to 100, what did they call them? Methane bombs, potential methane bombs, which sounds highly alarming. Can you sort of amplify, clarify a bit what's going on there, what these sites really are, and what the methane bombs are?
Sure. So the data set they referred to, Kairos, is based off of TROPOMI, as you know, which is an ESA instrument on the Sentinel-5P satellite. Yeah, and it has a fairly coarse resolution of like 7 by 5 kilometers, but it is able to detect large methane plumes on the order of 10,000 kilograms per hour or more. And what the Kairos system does is it has a nice quick algorithm that can quickly determine these plumes from the output from TROPOMI and provide those to UNEP, and as well as to the Guardian, as it seems. Now, what they're seeing then are very large emissions, but they can come from a multitude of sectors, including waste, coal, oil, and gas. And if you look at them, at any given time, it's hard to determine necessarily what the cause of a specific plume is. It could be an operation that was planned in an oil and gas basin. It could be an accident, or it could be just an unlit flare or something like that. So you really have to do a lot of detective work before you can determine the root cause. And you can't ever really determine it all entirely from the satellite. And that's why Mars is really important in our cooperative approach to working with the operators to try to really understand the root causes of these large emissions and hopefully eventually eliminate them entirely.
Okay. So there's a sort of investigative mechanism that kicks in when one of these sort of priority sites is identified, and to understand what's causing it. And maybe we can talk about mitigation a little bit later on. How is IMEO is sort of this umbrella organization? It's under UNEP, but it's independent. What's the relationship? Megan?
No, so we are fully a part of UNEP. We are a UNEP project hosted within the Secretariat. So everything that IMEO does is a UNEP project, but it's the focal point through which we conduct the methane work related to data, to science, to super emitter detection, et cetera. We work closely as well with our counterparts also within UNEP, the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, who are also a core implementing partner of the Global Methane Pledge, focused largely on policy and strategy development and supporting countries to develop methane action plans. So collectively, we work together under the UNEP umbrella to support countries towards achieving those global methane pledge goals. But as IMEO, yes, we are fully within the UNEP umbrella, in fact.
Okay. So you're funded through the UN mechanisms?
We're funded through governments and philanthropies. So our funding comes in dedicated to IMEO, okay, rather than through the general UN system.
So you have your own budget, which is good, but also places a responsibility for the future. I've seen a figure of 100 million over 5 years coming from EU, US, and Bezos. Is that's correct?
That particular figure is the budget that we estimated to be really necessary in order to achieve the reductions that we need and to function at the level at which we believe is necessary in order to adequately tackle the problem of methane emissions. Okay. It is not precisely the funding level at which we're operating.
Okay. But hopefully as you get going, then the budget need will become clearer, the justification will become clearer, and you will have a clearer path to developing sustained budget. Okay. How have the various governments reacted to setting up Mars? Has that been a simple process or a very hard process?
I think that we've seen a variety of different reactions from governments around the world on Mars in particular, and also on the subject of methane emissions. Even in the last 3 to 5 years that we've been working through UNEP on IMEO, we've witnessed a very reassuring growth in the attention on methane emissions and the political ambition that we're witnessing around the world. Of course, when it comes to initiatives like Mars, which are using satellite data, there can sometimes be some different reactions, in particular because we can see certain countries better than others using satellites. And so there have been instances in which certain areas might feel more picked on than others just by virtue of the fact that they're better candidates for satellite detection. Something that we feel very strongly about within UNEP and IMEO is that Mars is not intended to be a platform through which we're pointing fingers at anybody or blaming anybody for methane emissions or the climate crisis. Mars is intended to be a platform through which we can collaborate and identify these events and work collectively to mitigate them. Our end goal is to mitigate these events, not to blame any individual actor. So that's the framework through which we are engaging governments, and are happy and pleased to be having fruitful conversations towards setting up the necessary systems to ensure that a notification leads to a mitigation.
Okay, well, I can imagine that there'll be situations where the evidence from Mars is challenged. Is that part of the current process? Do you have that those challenges, or how robust is Mars today, and how robust will it be in the future?
We haven't encountered that as of yet, though I expect at some point we may. But our intent is to present enough evidence from multiple satellites so that it's more difficult to refute a finding. And I think as we are able to educate different countries and governments and companies about satellites and their utility for tracking these types of emissions, I think it will improve over time.
Okay, that's great. Let's dig into that a little bit further then about the what satellite data. You mentioned Tropomi. There are a number of commercial initiatives in this scene. Is there a balance between public and private? What data will be used in Mars? Let's start off simply with that.
So I'll say Mars is generally open to any scientifically verified and transparent data that's available. And so what I mean by that is we need to have a very good understanding of the quality of the data being used, preferably having been vetted by the scientific community in some way. And we need that data to be transparent. So that means we have to eventually at some point be able to share this data openly with the public, in addition to immediately with operators and governments. So those are some constraints that are put upon us when dealing with any kinds of private sector data. So in general, at the moment, we're mostly relying upon public sector data. First off, from Tropomi, which we essentially use in a sort of a targeting capacity to show us where are places we should be looking for these types of large emissions.
Okay.
And then we're also using some of the higher resolution satellites like Sentinel-2 and Prisma with our own internal remote sensing experts to zoom in on these regions and because that's really ultimately the data we need to be able to do attribution to the facility level and then be able to connect that facility to a specific operator. So those are sort of the main data sets we're using at the moment. But like I said, we're kind of open to other data sets, provided they meet our criteria and we're able to find a funding mechanism.
So I mean, you sort of hint there at funding mechanisms. I mean, Tropomi, I guess, is provided under the free and open data policy from the Commission. Commercial data is that commercial data. So is there foreseen budget to buy data, or is that seen as being coming from donations, or how is that perceived? I'm sure that would be a question if it's not already that would come up.
Do you want to take that one, Megan?
Sure, happy to speak to that. So as I mentioned, our funding for IMEO comes primarily through governments and philanthropies, and in particular related to Mars, we've been working closely with both the Global Methane Hub and the Bezos Earth Fund who have been providing this initial support towards Mars and towards its objectives and the data collection needs that we have internally. So we'll continue to work closely as well with the European Commission and the US government. As you noted, those are both two of the conveners of the Global Methane Pledge, and Mars is a major contribution towards the Global Methane Pledge to help countries achieve that target of 30% reduction. So we'll continue to work within all of those avenues for our funding support.
Okay. So let me understand a bit more from the oil and gas side. So you have a partnership with, this over 100 of the major oil and gas companies. Their commitment is to provide data, as I understand it. What data is it? Are there other commitments that they're making? And what data are they providing to you?
Yeah, so the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership, as I mentioned, it's a voluntary framework, so the companies choose to join it. And what they commit to is to reporting their methane emissions across all of their operations. This includes both operated and non-operated assets for all material sources of methane emissions. Through the OGMP, there are 5 reporting levels laid out, the first being your most basic emissions factors, and the highest levels reconciling both bottom-up and top-down measurements at a statistically significant proportion of their operations. So when a company joins, they're committing to reaching those highest levels within 3 years for their operated assets and within 5 years for their non-operated assets. And since OGMP started now 3 years ago, this coming reporting cycle, we're expecting to start to see that highest level of reporting for those initial companies who joined when we launched. Companies also commit to setting a methane reduction target. We have a target that we advocate for as UNEP, but we do not mandate a particular target to be set by companies. And companies that achieve all of these the requirements that I've laid out achieve gold standard status. This means that they're operating at the best practices that we've laid out through the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership. So that is the data that's provided to UNEP and is integrated into the broader data infrastructure that we're working with. In particular, through Mars, we also request that OGMP member companies provide us with information on the location of facilities as well as contact information for asset managers. This information stays completely private to UNEP, but allows us to better contact the actual stakeholders who can take action. So if we're able to detect an event and then compare it to this database of facilities that we have through the OGMP, we can hopefully localize it directly to where the source is, and then in our files as well, have the contact person for that asset manager and be able to notify them within a matter of days rather than a matter of weeks or months if we have to go through other sources.
Okay. Let's there are a number of questions coming up. The first one is sorry, I'm struggling to read. Yasya Maya asking about research and estimating emissions from plumes. Yeah, Vasya, do you want to come in? Okay. Well, the question is around what research is going on in the alongside the activities, and particularly the quantification of emissions.
So through IMEO, we also, as I mentioned, fund direct measurement studies. So this is largely the research that we're doing in terms of direct measurement. And this could be through a variety of different sources. We do these for the oil and gas sector, for the waste sector, the coal sector, and we're starting to move into agriculture as well. And the goal of this is not only to improve the data that's available, but also to improve the methodologies available for for quantification as well. And Cynthia, I don't know if you want to add anything on the remote sensing side.
Yeah, specifically for satellites, we've funded a number of these controlled release experiments that different satellites have participated in to better assess their quantification capabilities. And we'll probably intend to do more of those in the future.
Yaska, does that answer your question, or you want to develop further? No, you're on mute. You're muted. Or you're not muted, but we can't hear you. Okay. I'll give you one more chance to work it out. We've talked about oil and gas and these sort of infrastructure and sort of major emissions. We said it's only about a third, just over a third of the total methane emissions. Agriculture being the main, and waste is another source. What's happening about these other sources? What steps are being taken regarding those? So it's not just energy.
Yeah, so you certainly we're well aware of the importance of these other sectors and are working to move into them. As you noted at the beginning, we began with a focus on the oil and gas sector and quickly expanded into coal, because these are the sectors with the most technically feasible and also the most cost effective ways of reducing emissions in the near term. We are rapidly expanding into both waste and agriculture. For waste, we actually funded our first study on landfill emissions in Canada and are looking to fund other similar studies in the future. And we're building up our internal expertise on agriculture for the moment. As I'm sure many people here are aware, the direct measurements in agriculture are a little bit more complicated due to the dispersed nature of the sources. So we're in the process right now of designing frameworks through which we can actually conduct baseline measurement studies in countries where we look at emissions across all sectors, but are in particular thinking through how we as IMEO approach that for the agricultural sector.
Okay. Cynthia, you mentioned just now about taking data from different sources and using satellite data, analyzing that data within UNEP. Is that 100% the business model? Are there opportunities for companies to get involved in analytical work here, or is it seen as being too sensitive and needs to be internalized? What's the policy there?
No, indeed, our partners Kairos very much help us out with a lot of the analysis, both of the Tropomi data, but also Sentinel-2 data in certain regions. We take over a lot of the work with satellites such as Prisma and MMAP, owing to the fact that they're not commercially available for that purpose at this moment. So we are happy to share the burden of doing these retrievals with others. And indeed, we have limited human resources at the moment to do these, which slows the process down. So in the future, we're looking to expand both internally and potentially with partners to speed up some of those processes.
Okay, I mean, we're seeing increased company interest in this sector, and as we hinted earlier, the funding models will need to be worked out, but certainly if the opportunities are there, then people will be interested to support that.
Yeah, paramount is that having proprietary algorithms that aren't transparent makes it difficult. So the more transparent the work, the better. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that's something that's manageable. I believe. Kristen Hasselwin has asked about the commercial data, but I think we've pretty well covered that. Christian, if you don't feel it is, put a subsequent question, a subsidiary question in, and I'll come back to you later. Anthony Delavoye is looking about sort of the quantification of the emissions. It's a little bit like the first question, but Anthony, do you want to develop that?
Yeah, I can. It was, I think, yeah, thanks for the interesting talk. I think we kind of answered this question. I was just trying to understand the framework a bit of, like, because I understood that in Mars there is no quantification, right? Which is more in the science part, right? Okay, just
No,
just
we
for
will
me to
be making quantifications where possible within Mars. So it's
Okay.
not always possible, of course, but where we can, we will. And of course,
Okay.
we'll attach an uncertainty to those quantifications.
Oh, cool. Yes. Okay. Great. Thanks.
One point linked to that that's been drawn to my attention is the question of how the measurements are quantified, what the units of the measurements, and there seems to be two different approaches here, which I'm not quite sure why they're, where each is coming from. But one looking at measuring ppm, which I guess is much more associated with on-ground in situ measurements, and the other you yourself cited earlier, the satellites measuring in kilograms per hour per square kilometer or some such. Is this something which is recognized? Is it something that's being addressed?
We intend to put out emissions as a rate, simply because this is the most relatable quantification for the operators.
Mm-hmm.
Helps them to better understand what's going on the ground. I think, you can do somewhat either of them and derive one from the other if you do some work. So I think it's a matter of taste, perhaps, and a matter of your audience as to which one you use. And since our audience is really the operators who are on the ground mitigating the event, we want to communicate to them in the way that they understand the best. Okay,
but it will be linked to rate and I guess some form of area relationship as well, so the density.
Yeah, we'll publicize the methodology by which we do any kind of estimations.
Okay. It's been pointed out about the ambiguity of Mars, which from our community in the agricultural community has a different meaning, but I think that's a little bit historical. We have to take the context of Mars. So Steve, good to see you, Steve. You're asking about IOGP.
Yeah, just a question there. When I was in ESA, we worked a lot with the oil and gas companies on technologies to find new resources and also on gas flares. We worked with individual companies, Total, Shell and BP, but we found it very effective actually to push the relationship up to the level of the International Association of Oil and Gas Producers. And I'm wondering if you do the same.
To an extent, yes. So we do have good working relationships with other industry partnerships like IOGP, OGCI, MGP as well. So to the extent that we can collaborate, we do. Obviously, the frameworks for all of these things are a little bit different, but our team within IMEO that leads the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership does work closely with other industry associations.
Yeah, it takes a bit of effort to set these things up, but once they're up and running, we found them very, very effective indeed at the level of the industry. And I'm sure you remember that, Jeff.
Yes, yeah, very much so. I can see the advantage of a two-pronged approach here to communicate and get sort of industry-wide involvement, but you need the individual companies engaged in terms of providing the commitments and the data, and that wouldn't work at association level. Have all sorts of issues. Interesting question from Orestes Bayer about different approaches to measuring. I can understand the question. Orestes, please, can you explain further?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Very nice talk. The question regards I don't know if it's a new domain, but it's the general under the theme Earth observation for official statistics. So you have Eurostat on one hand I mean, and national statistical agencies, at least in Europe, that go bottom up to create emission accounts by utilizing socioeconomic data, such as cattle feed or sales of livestock, etc. So you have a completely different data stream for a total for a country, which is on top. The good part is that it is also broken down per sector. So you have agriculture separate, oil and gas, I suppose, etc. So I was wondering whether you do any checks regarding the totals. This is the one point. And the second point is that perhaps it would be of interest to the statistical authorities, Eurostat, UNGIM, I don't know, whoever, to get feedback from you with respect to geospatial disaggregation of their total. So at least they know where is it, which region emits. So this is my two questions, actually, something like this. Thanks.
2 questions in one.
I would say we're very involved with the inventory community and plan to be more so in the future. And we're slowly gathering up the data we need to be able to do those sorts of comparisons. In many respects, it's difficult because it is a little bit of an apples to orange perspective at the moment, as the satellites can only detect, above certain thresholds, whereas the inventories are meant to be representative of the whole spectrum of emissions. But our goal is to be able to try to do some sort of reconciliation between these types of bottom-up and top-down observations. And we certainly know from many studies, especially in oil and gas production, that indeed, oftentimes there's a disagreement between the bottom-up version of emissions and the top-down version of emissions. And so it's important for us to understand why that disparity exists, because it helps us to really pinpoint where the best targets for mitigation are. And so the data that we're gathering with IMEO will hopefully be a useful tool for inventory compilers in the future for verification of their inventories and hopefully for improvement of inventories going forward.
And certainly for these other sources, satellites will be of limited use, so you will need these other approaches.
Right. This is why we also have our science studies, which use multiple scales of observation to try to drill down and get a better understanding of the whole spectrum of observations, not just this, the super fat tail of the emissions that the satellites are useful for.
Yeah. I mean, in that respect, Ben Poulter is asking about different platforms and the role of different platforms in these measurements. Ben, do you want to come in?
Yes, yeah, thank you for the presentations and discussion. It's been really fascinating. Yeah, the question is sort of in the context of how Mars will handle things like cloud cover, low sun angles, and even nighttime methane leaks, where the current constellation of greenhouse gas satellites are all passive instruments that rely on enough sunlight to get a signal. So so I was just wondering sort of how Mars is dealing with that, and yeah, your comments. Thanks.
I would say I don't think that's up to Mars to deal with. I hope that's something that the satellite community will work on and make available to Mars. What Mars is really trying to do is to bring the best available data that we have now and turn it into action. So all those problems you mentioned, we do want to be able to tackle them in the future, but we're going to rely on the community to bring those technologies to bear on the problem first. It's not something that we have the capability of doing ourselves. We are rather sort of users of the data and trying to bring that data to the hands of those who have the facility to act on that data.
Very good. I mean, that's again normally you're platform agnostic. Whatever's best for the particular measurement. So if you need data, people can provide the data and use whatever platform is best for providing it. That sounds very very pragmatic. I said at the beginning that we were working under the sort of link to the ERSC Green Deal Working Group. Monica's posted a comment about that in the chat. I draw everyone's attention to. So Monica is the works for ERSC, is animating the Green Deal. Do you want to explain a little bit more about the work of that group, Monica?
Yes, hi Jeff. I was just taking notes, so no planning myself to talk. Yes, indeed, sadly, we have in the framework of the Green Deal, we are working in different thematics, and the methane monitoring is one of those. So we are reacting now to the 16 that is on the plate of the trialogue, the 16 proposal for a regulation of methane emissions. So this is out. Actually, the discussion that we are having, and in particular triggers us the concept how it's placed on the regulation, the concept of the UNEPs, because it is a kind of exclusive for I will say in situ data, and not very expensive to satellite derived data in the units itself. One is dedicated to parts per million, while if we want to embrace other type of technologies like satellite derived data, it should be maybe kilograms per hour, sorry, that will be the ideal solution. So maybe you will have any views on that regard. And exactly this is why we are now discussing with the members of the parliament and also the council, because to understand why these units are in place.
Okay, we talked about that a little bit earlier. So the working group is picking up on the different issues, particularly working with the European Commission, as I mentioned, and the European institutions, which is a target, and trying to ensure that they are, the industry is positioned, is ready to respond. Question about collaboration with ECMWF. Yuri, do you want to develop? Yuri Rubrek, do you want to develop that further?
Hi Jeff. Hi Megan and I forgot your name, but Miss Reynolds. Well, a very interesting talk, and of course, I'm building also on the comment of Orestes as well, to see what the possible alignment of the global initiatives are with the European initiatives. We've got the CAM developing, the methane monitoring, to building on the ESA, EASI satellites, and the Japanese GOSAT satellite. So the developing this kind of methodology to feed into the possible future legislation that was just mentioned as well, to feed the data in. And I think there should be an alignment on the possible methodologies and data used as well, to come to the common understanding and acceptation of the science data that's being provided through the Mars initiative, but also to the future CAMS initiatives as well. And so in this case, I was wondering to what extent are you already collaborating with the people from the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasts as well, that are developing these models. And they also got a fundamental budget for developing these things also under the Green Deal, using through Destination Earth and all these things. So I think they'll be moving forward. And I was just interested to see to what extent you are accepting the same boundary conditions for measuring the methane emissions and so on globally and at European level. I think that would be quite interesting to see if we can collaborate on these things as well. And I know that you're also using European funding to develop the Mars system as well. So moreover, it would be very interesting that at least you have an interoperable way of developing your measurements and visions on the methane emissions. So, in a nutshell. Sorry, Jeff.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to respond?
So we are in contact with CAMS and ECMWF. What they're doing is really constituent data assimilation at a larger scale than what Mars is interested in, since Mars is really interested in point source information, and they're more sort of interested at regional to country scale emissions. So they're kind of complementary products, I would say. So I don't think right now we overlap. However, I think as we move forward and Mars gets available more data at sort of a global level, such as from methane sat, we might find more overlap with what they're doing. But right now, they're really complementary data sets, I'd say.
Oh, thanks a lot. But just to mention this, point source will become increasingly important in Europe as well, involving the agriculture. And I think the estimation, the view on how the impact of, for example, a nitrates directive on how cattle management will be done at European level, the link with the common agriculture policy becomes increasingly important. So I think point source information in the future will be an essential part of monitoring the impact of some of the intervention at European level. So I guess that even collaboration in the future will have to be further developed in a kind of, well, maybe it's collaborating and adding and having a full holistic perspective on methane emissions, not just on the larger sources.
Can I just interrupt and ask you to put your microphone down? Then we'll be able to actually be able to hear you.
Yeah, that would be much better. Sorry for this. I hope that at least you understood something of what I said. Yeah, you know, it's better for Wi-Fi, but when it's down, it's better for audio. Sorry for this.
We could hear you, so I hadn't picked up that the microphone was up. Whoever intervened, thank you very much for doing so. Any comments? Further comments?
No, I agree. I think we'll see how it evolves in the future, but at the moment, what they're doing and what we're doing are a little bit tangential, maybe.
But it's clearly complementary, and that's important as well. And I think having both sources and having all these data coming together in the end, at least should give us the initial evidence base for further policy development and policy assessment, and that's quite important from our perspective, and also from the Green Deal perspective. So thanks a lot, also for the presentations and the discussions.
Thanks. There's a question from Tristan about sort of detection limits. And I was wanting to ask that as well, and also about sort of spatial resolution. I mean, obviously you want as good a data as you can get, but do you have in mind any limits at the moment where either top or down or minimum limits that are applied in terms of thresholds and spatial resolution?
I think the really only, maybe not limit, but requirement is that we do have these high resolution data sets that enable us to attribute plumes to facility level, because that's really the main way that we're able to communicate these emissions to operators and actually get action to happen. If we have ambiguous data that can't localize the emission to that scale, then we can be sending, 20 operators on a Easter egg hunt to try to find an emission that may have already passed, and that gets tricky. So we really sort of tend to need more of these higher resolution satellites. There's not enough of them, I'd say right now. It's hard to get acquisitions, as many as you might want.
Yeah.
And so I think the more of those out there for point source, the better.
And in terms of emission thresholds?
The lower you can go, the better, right? The more of the emissions that we can see, the better. EMIT has been proving really useful on the ISS with what it can see, even though its sort of global coverage is a little bit limited due to its mission over desert areas, but it's seen a lot of plumes, and it's been a really fascinating data set.
Okay. So carry on. Question about a white paper. So I guess that's a link in the chat, and that's addressed to another question as well. Okay. What is the work plan regarding the assessment of agricultural emissions? Okay, so this is coming back to the broadening and to whether you have a work plan. Anthony, do you want to just explain that a bit more? And I'm just going to slip out for just a moment to try and shut my dog up.
Yeah, so this is just to understand what is in the IMEO initiative, what is the future regarding the agriculture, because it's one of the, if not the biggest part of the methane emissions, and it's still it's harder to assess than oil and gas emissions, let's say. But I wanted to know what is what would be the future for you and how you see collaborations in this context.
Certainly. So as I mentioned, in the near term, what we are doing currently is working within IMEO to build our agricultural expertise. So we've brought in some new team members who are helping us think through our agricultural strategy. We also have a scientific oversight committee of IMEO, which advises us on all of our scientific objectives and also approves all of the studies that we fund for direct measurement. And we are in the process now of creating a subcommittee on agriculture, who will also advise the development and implementation of this agricultural strategy and will be integral to the process of identifying and approving the initial tranche of studies for the agricultural sector.
Okay. So it's costing me a lot in bribes for the dog today. Christian is asking about the timing of these things, which again is quite critical. Perhaps you can comment. Christian, do you want to just come in quickly?
Sure, yeah. So thank you for the discussion and the presentation, but really appreciate that. Yeah, so I'm just curious about what's your desire, what's your intent in terms of how quickly you can notify operators based upon sort of detections from your satellite data?
I would say as soon as possible. However, we do have, of course, limitations on that with data processing times, but moreover, the detective work it takes to determine the facility and the facility operator is a bit of a bottleneck at the moment to the notification process. So we're working through that and trying to reduce those times. But I would say, ideally, we'd get notifications out in a week or so. Or less, but that's a goal and aspiration at the moment. And I think we just have to continue to work towards it as we refine our processes.
Most of the events are a long-term, long duration.
So we can focus our attention on different types of events. One event is sort of maybe more of a sporadic event that isn't very long duration. At the moment, we're not focusing on those because that would require this really fast sort of connection between the emission and the source and the operator. The other possibility is to look at regions or areas where we know there are sort of hotspots of emissions where they have sort of long-term history of having emissions events. And in this case, we can sort of build up a historical record of emissions, not necessarily all from the exact same source, but in perhaps the same region, maybe from the same operator, and provide those to the operator on a reasonable time basis for action.
Okay, there are two questions outstanding in the chat, so I'm going to take those and then we'll draw to a close. The first one is again from Orestes about the needs for in situ measurements. Orestes.
Yes, you mentioned earlier about the explicit measuring campaigns. You mentioned the control release experiments. I suppose you are using some standard, not from the operator's perspective, other scientific data providers for in situ measurements. And I was wondering whether there are in situ gaps or challenges, perhaps a complete blank area that you only have satellite, and you are not very happy about this. Something, how do you handle the in situ ground truth thing, apart from the explicit campaigns?
Right now, we again rely on sort of the satellite data providers to do that type of validation work with in situ data. Our focus has been with the controlled release experiments where we have a scientifically controlled emission at a known leak rate. And then we ask the different satellites to provide their leak quantification. in sort of a, I guess, double-blind sort of type test. So yeah, right now the validation is left to the individual satellites to do and publish, importantly.
Thanks.
Okay. We talked beforehand about the sort of visibility of this data. And you mentioned that it would be, for the moment, it's only for the stakeholders, but it will become sort of publicly visible a bit later on. What's the time frame for this data to become sort of more widely available to the outside world?
So starting July 1st of this year, we will begin publicizing emissions once they are 45 to 75 days old. We maintain that holding period due to some of our contractual obligations with the data providers, as well as giving us time to sort of scientifically vet the data before we publicize it to the greater public. But then that will be continuously populated with events once they age into the appropriate time frame.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. So last question I'm going to take, Jessica. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your
Don't
name.
worry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we hear you now. Yeah.
Oh, excellent. I had the wrong microphone connected. Anyway, thanks and very nice to meet you. Yeah, my question is about how do you intend to engage with the policymakers and the stakeholders? Because that's one of the very difficult, especially on a global scale, there's not one policymaker for each country that you're probably aware of. So it's not going to be easy. And just to introduce myself, maybe I'm responsible for the CO2 monitoring mission of the Copernicus. And despite its name, it will also measure methane at the order of magnitude better scale than Tropomi, and also a much better precision. So hopefully we can also contribute to your Mars system. How far we can do that, it's to be confirmed. And I also look forward to hopefully meet you in Paris at the conference. Anyway, let's not distract from the question. So yeah, how are you able to find your policymakers and stakeholders?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and I think you've hit the nail on the head that it's not going to look exactly the same in every country because not every government is structured exactly the same way. So as Cynthia mentioned, we're launching the public version of Mars starting in July. So we're currently in a pilot phase at the moment, and during this phase, we are trying to do just that, to work with countries to identify the right stakeholders within the government who should receive notification and to collaboratively design an approach for what happens once a notification is received. Our goal is to hopefully create some best practices because we certainly won't have the bandwidth to fully design the process for every country in the world, but to have a couple of good case studies of what this could look like that can be replicated. We're working closely with partners in the International Energy Agency and the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, as well as the diplomatic arms of the US government and the European Commission as well, to help with broad-ranging access amongst all of us to where we can find the right connections within governments and who we need to be talking to and what processes need to be designed. This is supported by the work that we've been doing over the last couple of years to raise awareness and build capacity in governments. We've been doing this at IMEO, as well as the IEA and CCAC have been, as well as other partners. So there's already a good breadth of stakeholders within governments who have some capacity on methane emissions. And so we're starting our engagement from that point and working to move from there to something more concrete within different governments. But it's certainly a challenge, and certainly one that I think will take a flexible approach depending on where we're working.
Very good. Yeah. I just maybe as another announcement is that I'm now responsible within CEOS for the greenhouse gas task team, and we are facing very similar topics, trying to address also these kind of aspects. So yeah, let's get in touch. But okay, that's for Absolutely. The offline. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica, and thank you very much, Megan and Cynthia, for this this discussion. I think it's been fascinating. And it would be great to have you back in a reasonable time, with some stories and maybe updates on how the system is working and how it's evolving, and how you're dealing with some of these issues that have been put on the table today. So I really appreciate that. Do you have any final things you want to say to people here? Any requests or comments?
No, just thank you, and I hope to meet up with some of you in the future.
Yeah, I would just echo the same. It was great to see such a engaging and interactive group on this subject, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks to you for joining us. So that will draw the end for this EOcafe. Our next EOcafe will be in 4 weeks' time. We're a victim of our sort of regularity in that we fix it for every 2 weeks on a Thursday at 4 o'clock. In 2 weeks' time, much of Europe and certainly the Commission and the institutions are on holiday before Easter, before Pâques. So we will not be here in 2 weeks, but we will be back in 4 weeks, and we'll have Simonetta Kelly, the Director of Earth Observation in ESA, back to give us an update on the outcomes of the ministerial, the way the programs are being put in place as a result of the ministerial. It's also our 3-year anniversary, so we're very pleased that Simonetta will join us for the 3-year anniversary of the EOcafe, which started shortly after the lockdown started in the COVID crisis, and it's already 3 years. So hope to see you all here next time. Lots of discussion with ESA. Our final reminder, I'm not allowed not to remind you that any company with us who's not yet filled in the industry survey, please do so. We really want your views. They're very important for us. They're very important for the European policymakers. So if you haven't filled it in, please go follow the link here and do so. And that's basically it. So thank you very much, and see you in 4 weeks time. Now we have we turn off the recording. Anyone who wants to just open up their microphones and comment, please